usual. But then I believe your president is somebody who's determined to bring new ground, and I want to commend him for that. He obviously believes in the inclusive approach, and I appreciate that. I was going to use the word progressive, but I'm not sure what that is. Can I just say that it is a pleasure to be sharing the platform with Ambassador Anthony Johnson, who we have both known from the age when we were both 13. But I was a little bit of we were both 13 at the time. And his daughter, who is a friend of my daughter, so I'm establishing credentials. Yeah. But beyond that, I would just say that there's a distinguished economist, Nobel laureate called Amartya Sen in India, who has this position that every individual is made up or possesses multiple identities, and that one of the ways to create a more harmonious society is to find the particular identity with which one individual can relate to another. And that's not quite an appropriate introduction to what I'm about to say next, but there are members of your affiliation, members of the organization to which you're affiliated, with whom I have a really quite distinct connection. I was partly responsible for the education of one Keith Russell, and also one Ernest Augustus Smith, a recent member of Parliament. In the case of the latter, he was one of those very passionate, patriotic students at the school at which I taught. I actually proposed a toast at his wedding with a family friend. Well, of course, he didn't become a political opponent at some stage. Unfortunately for him, it went the other way. But we still remain good friends, and I still meet his daughters in church, and we get along very well together. Now, Ambassador Johnson left me a very difficult task, which I'm going to do, because my understanding when I was told to prepare for the mid-years, and the mid-years were captioned as Journey on the Rough Seas. I therefore presume that coming from a G2K perspective, this will be about the 1970s and so on, which would be understandable. But let me just say that, quite frankly, the decade of the 60s was a very exciting decade. I remember being at Gordon House, outside Gordon House, when that first Independence Parliament was meeting, and people were gathered there sitting I was standing on top of my car so I could get a glimpse of what was going on there. And it was all really very exciting to be part, as a young person then, part of this new development. And I remember a gentleman standing down when Norman Manley spoke, hearing me say, and you said we couldn't go it alone. Which was very unfortunate because Norman Manley, and I'm not contradicting anything that Anthony has said, Norman Manley from 1938 was a believer in nationhood and set about supporting the development of the Jamaican nation. He was as anti-empire as anybody else could be, but he knew that there were processes involved. But the decade of the 60s was a decade of excitement, of growth, strong economic growth, as Anthony has hinted at. And it is just in the nature of things that that decade, which was led by Sir Alexander Bustamante and then Sir Donald Sangster, and then the Honorable Hugh Shearer, most excellent Hugh Shearer, came to an end after 10 years. But that's the nature of Jamaican politics. We leave in this to think about it now. The years that I was particularly focusing on, because I did an actual mathematical calculation of record, that the mid-years of 50 would be between late 79 and early 96. And most people, you wouldn't be particularly conscious of those years in detail, but most people in this kind of gathering would be saying that those are the years which are bracketed at the opening by socialism and shortages, and at the closing by devaluation and the need for FinSAC. Now, I'm saying to you, that is certainly one perspective. They could also be described as the years of incipient self-reliance, the raising of national consciousness, followed by, in the 1980s, the Jamaicanization of industry under the Most Honorable Edward Seago, economic growth, and in the early 90s, liberalization of the economy and facing the greater challenges of globalization. Because that has been the process. That has been the pattern. And I just have to say that in looking at the growth of a nation, development within a nation like ours, we really must not expect to have linear movement. It is rarely the case that the trajectory is all straight line and up. There are going to be periods of ups and downs, and there are going to be fluctuations along the way. But that is a capsule of those middle years, the journey on the rough seas. Let me just say that, as I see it, the major inhibitors to progress in those middle years were, among other things, the intensified tribal politics of the time. There is no doubt that we moved away at that period from what Rex Network used to call the game, the rules of the political game, which were more evident in the days of Alexander Bustamante and Norman Manley. I don't know if Anthony can confirm this, but I've always learned that the reason why there was a period of nearly 6 years between the 1949 and the 1955 general election is that Bustamante, who was the premier, chief minister in 1949, was conscious of the fact that in 1954, when the election should have been held, Norman Manley was not very well. And he delayed the election to allow for his recovery. Well, that was the kind of gentlemanly, accommodating approach shared by those two leaders. And I have to say that that kind of convention was not very evident in those mid-years of which we speak. There was also, in my judgment, inadequate communication with citizens. It was as though the leadership kept to itself in its own silo, and the communication with average citizens, the public out there, was not particularly good. The rhetoric was divisive. Now I can quite understand. The whole socialist dialogue, discussion, conversation, vocabulary did in fact frighten some people. And again, I say because communication was inadequate, was not good. And as a result, there was lack of consensus on major national issues. And when I say consensus, I mean beyond the legal or constructional arrangements which we have now where Prime Minister consults the government on certain things. But there really was not that kind of consensus that was built among the people or even among the parties in relation to major decisions being taken. And so, there we had many years which were undoubtedly very rough. But I have to say, and research will confirm it, that nothing that happened between middle 70s and middle 90s was really ever lost. Where there were difficulties, where there was migration from this country, many people remained, created their business opportunities, or worked them through. Where there were shortages, people became creative, innovative, entrepreneurial, and there was a real sense that we were becoming a much more self-reliant and self-sufficient nation. I'm going to mention a few milestones, as I was asked to. These are not limited to the middle years. They begin, and I mention these as critical indicators because I have to say, there has grown up a kind of cynicism about political leadership. And many people forget that virtually all the benefits which they enjoy today, in terms of opportunities for education, in terms of legal rights, in terms of infrastructural development and so on, these things have come as a result of political decision. And one of the challenges I would urge the G2K to take up is to educate membership and the general public about the role of politics, and not to focus simply on the negative behaviors in politics, but to look at the outcomes that politics have brought to this nation. Now, I'm going to mention a few of the milestones which I believe are very important to our appreciation in this 50th year of how far we have come. The National Insurance Scheme, founded by Lyndon George Newman, one of the most far-reaching pieces of social legislation in this country. That set the foundation for the social safety net which is enjoyed now by many persons living in this country. I mentioned something else which is not necessarily part of having its genesis in politics, but was certainly supported by political administrations. There was a campaign which had the slogan, "Two is better than too many." Now, you're too young to appreciate that, but you're probably the beneficiaries of that policy, of that slogan, because it really was about family planning and birth control, because our population was really running ahead of itself. The NHT, the National Housing Trust, an institution which was born out of crisis, a situation where the government was concerned about level of taxation, lack of growth, and the need for housing. National Housing Trust was created out of a felt need for an institution of that kind that could make housing available and an investment in the village. The free education policy, which was not sustained, but created a thrust, a surge on the part of one segment, but at a point in time when large numbers of persons at secondary and tertiary level were able to advance their development at no cost to their parents. Job training and certification, the hard trust in the 1980s, one of the major contributors to workforce development. The Electoral Advisory Committee, which eventually became the Electoral Commission of Jamaica, which now has local and international confidence and supports it, and that itself was supported by improved political leadership and improved political leadership culture. Not only was the idea of having an electoral commission a political decision, but it has the idea of bringing people into a more responsive attitude towards elections and to voting and to inter-party rivalry was also led by political leaders of the day, of the time. And finally, well, not finally, removal of the telecoms monopoly, another signal decision and action delivered as a result of political considerations, and which finally awakened a new entrepreneurial spirit in that field and elsewhere. So I mentioned these things to say that the middle years, that is to say between the 60s and the 2000s, have had problems. But I believe that out of those problems, we have been able to grow in many areas. Economic growth, yes. Social development, confidence, pride in self. We have, in fact, now one of the most appreciated health sectors in the world. And the international community has given Jamaica high kudos for the quality of health care and the fact that it translates into average life expectancy which is on par with the developed world, and a rate of infant mortality which is also on par with the developed world. So I leave you with that. There's certainly a number of issues which will arise as we talk about going forward, but that's for other presenters. So Floyd, thank you very much.